This video has been made possible thanks to Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations allows players to take part in hypothetical military strategies in a tactical game, where you can choose which country you want to lead in a modern global war scenario, and engage in combat with up to 128 other players in real time, in games that can take weeks to complete. Once you have an account, you can play on PC or mobile. Now I know it might seem strange to some people to talk about war video games when we are witnessing a real war every day on our screens, but make no mistake, Conflict of Nations is a video game that, like chess, doesn't hurt anyone. It's the ideal pastime for those of us who like to spend some time speculating on the defensive capabilities of different countries without having to harm anyone. We wish Vladimir Putin had devoted his free time to Conflict of Nations instead of destroying the lives of so many people. And now, the best of all, if you click on the link in the description, you can unlock your exclusive gift of 13,000 units of gold and get 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so click the link now and start moving your troops and planning your battle. In the end, the strangest thing happened. On 9th of March 2022, South Korea's latest presidential election took place. An election that broke a historical tradition in the young South Korean democracy, the alteration of government between conservatives and progressives every 10 years. This time, VisualPolitik fans, things were different. We have already covered this in the weekly snapshot, the newsletter that all of you who are part of the VisualPolitik community on Patreon receive. South Korea has just undergone a political upheaval. After only 5 years, the conservatives are back in power, and they are not doing it with just any candidate. Did you see this video? It has been in response to Yoon Seok-yeol's victory. Listen up. If Yoon had been told just 12 months ago that he would become president a year later, he would have laughed for sure. The South Korean president-elect is a political outsider. Until March 2021, he was the Attorney General of the country, appointed, as it happens, by the outgoing president, Moon Jae-in himself. Quite the plot twist. As Attorney General, Yoon Seok-yeol was known to be ruthless against corruption. In fact, he was the architect of the imprisonment of 2 former South Korean presidents, the conservatives Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, who were accused of corrupt practices such as bribery and influence peddling. However, as we shall see, that was not what won him the election. His victory, by the way, was achieved by a very narrow margin, 48.56% of the votes against 47.83% of his progressive opponent. Less than 1 point of difference. Fewer than 250,000 votes. Now, what could explain the disruption of the historic 10-year alternation of government? Why has Moon Jae-in become the first president whose party has lost the confidence of South Korean citizens after the first term? What future lies ahead for the Korean peninsula? Well, let's take a look.
Moon's legacy.
Moon Jae-in ran for election in 2017 with a series of perhaps too verbose and risky promises for a 5-year term. Remember that there is no presidential re-election in South Korea. You see, Moon promised to carry out a complete social, economic, and political overhaul that, among other things, included ending once and for all the close connections between politics and the chaebol, South Korea's big business conglomerates. He almost promised to move the president's office out of Seoul, to end civilian nuclear power, and the 2 most important issues, solve the serious problem of housing prices in Seoul and its wider metropolitan area, and to achieve peace with North Korea once and for all. Well, 5 years on, none of those major objectives have been fully achieved. We could even say that, considering his own expectations, his government has been a failure. He did not even manage to fulfill a minor promise, such as moving the president's office out of Seoul, something that, by the way, his own party is now criticizing the new president for. That's politics for you.
Yoon, Moon butt heads over moving president's office. Democratic Party lawmakers in the meeting questioned the rush, some hinting that Yoon might have undisclosed reasons for not wanting to move into the Blue House, such as Feng Shui.
Of course, this is the funniest part of the story. The following Not that much. There's the case of energy policy, which is much more far-reaching. In 2017, as soon as Moon Jae-in came to power, he announced a plan to phase out nuclear power in the country.
We will end the nuclear-orientated power generation plan and pave the way for a nuclear-free era. We will withdraw existing plans to build new nuclear power plants and not extend the lifespan of nuclear power plants. Moon Jae-in.
How badly some newspaper archives age. Because, of course, with the skyrocketing prices of natural gas and oil, and with coal prices also skyrocketing, things changed radically. Moon's own government suddenly seemed to be championing the pro-nuclear campaign.
South Korea's Trade and Energy Minister visiting Seoul nuclear power plant in the Gwangdong region called for speedy completion of nuclear reactors under construction to suggest easing in the nuclear phase-out policy in the face of soaring fuel prices.
Yes, rectifying is wise, but I don't know. In only 5 years, and after having been so categorical, let them at least admit they were wrong. But wait, because we have only just begun. For example, it is true that his policy towards North Korea has brought the greatest period of military stability on the Korean peninsula since the Sunshine Policy of the late 1990s. But in the end, except for his 3 summits with Kim Jong-un and the 2 with Trump, in which he acted as mediator, the results have not gone much further. You've seen the video, right? Well, that's it. During Moon Jae-in's presidency, North Korea continued its campaign of constant provocations. For example, Pyongyang launched dozens of missiles of various ranges, continued to insult the authorities of its southern neighbor in its state media, and just a few months after Moon came to power, they tested a hydrogen atomic bomb. The latter, however, nuclear testing, has been stopped dead in its tracks. The Korean peninsula has not seen a single nuclear detonation for 4.5 years. Of course, it could also be that this phase of the North's nuclear program has already been completed. The peak of activity came in June 2020 when North Korea literally blew up the Kaesong Inter-Korean Liaison Office, a symbol of dialogue between the two Koreas. Since then, diplomatic progress between the two Koreas has been frozen. In other words, despite his promises, Moon failed to conclude a peace agreement that would formally put an end to the Korean War once and for all. Because, for those of you who don't know, the Korean War did not officially end in 1953. A simple armistice, a ceasefire, was signed that year. So technically, the two countries are still at war. Well, the fact is that despite his promises, Moon did not achieve that diplomatic goal either. And you know what? It's almost better that way. Better not to imagine the concessions he would have had to make to take on that role. Finally, to conclude this list of major political failures and unfulfilled promises, we have perhaps the issue that has weighed most heavily in the defeat of the ruling party's candidate, the housing policy. A topic we have already talked about here on VisualPolitik. Since we made that video up until the recent elections, about 2 years have gone by, and things not only did not improve, but they actually got worse. Take a look. The average home price in Seoul, which is the most stressed area, has increased by 35% since Moon Jae-in came to power, and about 50% since 2015. In some areas of the city, housing prices have more than doubled. To give you an idea, this means that a South Korean who wants to buy an average apartment of about 880 square feet or 82 square meters in Seoul today will have to fork out more than $970,000 on average, when only 3 years earlier, in 2017, that same apartment would have cost about $590,000. So, of course, news headlines like this came as no surprise.
Moon admits failure of real estate policy.
Well, at least in this case, they have admitted it. That's something. As you can imagine, this has greatly disappointed young people who fervently trusted Moon in 2017. You may not remember, but he was described almost as South Korean Obama. Of course, here on VisualPolitik, we were not at all surprised by what happened. Most of Moon's measures were aimed at limiting demand, and very few at increasing the supply of housing. In short, these were the major mistakes that led to a historic change of course in South Korea. A change, of course, however, that has come about by a hair's breadth, and to tell the truth, with little enthusiasm on the part of South Koreans. It has to be said. But now the question we need to ask is, what plans does Yoon Seok-yeol have for South Korea? Well, let's take a look.
The Yoon era. What lies ahead for Korea?
Yoon Seok-yeol's narrow victory threatens to set South Korean politics in a whirlwind, for domestic politics, but also for foreign policy. And if there is one thing that characterizes Yoon, it is precisely that he is an unusual character. A very peculiar character. Yoon Seok-yeol openly declares himself to be anti-feminist, and in the campaign he liked to boast about it. He's also a follower of the Protestant Christian congregation of the Uodo Full Gospel Church. Apologies if that was pronounced incorrectly. We are talking about a religious congregation of some 800,000 members that is one of the most conservative in Korea, and whose leaders spearhead the I don't know if that's even right, but it's something like that, movements in the country. On the other hand, the former Attorney General is, in economic matters, a follower of Mises and Friedman's theories regarding the defense of the free market. He is a strong supporter of deregulation and low taxes. In fact, he is expected to put a technical profile close to these ideas at the helm of the country's economy. But let's make this a little more concrete. We have already told you about the main factors that have contributed to the defeat of the ruling party after Moon's presidency. So now the question is, what exactly are the new president's proposals to meet all these challenges? Well, one of the policies he advocated during his campaign was to bet again on nuclear energy. Yes, Moon's government cancelled the construction of several reactors, but now the new president believes that atomic energy is the best way for South Korea to obtain abundant, clean, and cheap energy for decades. In fact, when he appointed his panel of experts for the Presidential Transition Committee, several names of nuclear energy experts could be seen. Quite a statement of intent. Then, with regard to housing, undoubtedly one of the country's major social concerns, Yoon has pledged to promote public-private partnerships to build 2.5 million housing units nationwide during his 5-year term. Of these, 1.3 million will be in Seoul. That's on the supply side. On the fiscal side, Yoon says he will do the opposite of what Moon has done: ease restrictions on mortgages and reduce the capital gains tax. He has also proposed revising the real estate tax for multiple property owners in order to reduce the price of rents. This is a topic that has been getting a lot of attention in South Korea lately. Just think. According to the Korean Federation of Trade Unions, it would take an average 20-year-old South Korean a century to finish paying for a normal apartment in Seoul on his or her own. 100 years! In fact, according to a poll by the Herald Business and the Korea Society Opinion Institute, 1 in 4 voters believe that the stability of the housing market is the new president's greatest challenge. But that's not the end of it. South Korea is a country with a complicated foreign policy. The South Korean government has to deal with its communist neighbor to the north and delicately balance relations with China, Japan, and the United States. A balance that, quite often, becomes a headache. Well, all indications are that the next government will make a shift in its foreign policy to become more pro-US and also pro-Japan. Obviously, this may cool things down a bit with China. Without looking too far, the new president proposes such things as increasing the US THAAD anti-missile batteries, a deployment that has already cost South Korea a trade and tourism boycott by China.
I will rebuild the ROC-US alliance and strengthen the comprehensive strategic alliance while sharing the core values of liberal democracy, a market economy, and human rights. I will develop bilateral relations of mutual respect between Korea and China and create a future-oriented Korea-Japan relationship. Yoon Seok-yeol.
But okay, by this point in the video, I know that many of you are thinking, but what about North Korea? Well, do I need to remind you of Pyongyang's reaction? Like all conservative presidents, Yoon is in favour of returning to a hard line with Pyongyang. In this case, he even favours trying to get the United States to deploy more strategic weapons in Korea. Of course, he has also made it clear that he is willing to continue peace talks. The point is that whatever he does, we are likely to see a constant tug of war between the two Koreas, which has basically been the norm for decades. Or maybe not. Who knows? In Korea, the degree of unpredictability is always quite high. Finally, let's take a look at the economic measures that the new president has promised. The measures with which he hopes to restore the economic vitality to South Korea. Well, Yoon has announced a relentless fight against inflation, reducing bureaucracy in the economy, with up to 80 fewer regulations for companies, and making the labour market more flexible, for example, so that workers can work more overtime, something that was capped by the Moon government. He has also promised to work with Samsung Electronics to narrow the gap it currently has with Taiwan's TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. This is something that the new president considers strategic from both an economic and national security standpoint. As we've mentioned in past videos and Patreon bulletins, semiconductors are something of a holy grail for the economies of Taiwan and South Korea, and for advanced technologies in general in the 21st century. And from this point on the remaining issues, Yoon's plans are unclear for the moment. So here on VisualPolitik, we'll be paying close attention to how this apparent political flip-flop takes place, in which South Korea has gone from having a president who was compared to Obama to one who is being compared to Ronald Reagan. Only time will tell whether or not this is really an exaggeration. For now, it's your turn. Do you think that the new president will be able to correct South Korea's main problems with what you have seen? Will South Korea experience the kind of economic renaissance as Yoon predicts? What will happen to relations with China and North Korea? Leave us your comments below, and if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik so you don't miss any of our upcoming news. Remember that if you want to escape a hard day of work or study and switch off your mind, the free online PvP strategy game Conflict of Nations is worth checking out. Choose your country, design your strategy, and fight your way to victory. Click on the link in the description to get your unique starter pack, but remember that the offer is only available for 30 days. Once again, thank you so much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.